We will begin, as we always do, with the plain truth of it. At 47 years old, Ada Ferris had nothing left in this world but the clothes on her back and $11 sewn into her hem. Her husband was dead of trail fever, her wagon and goods stolen by the very men hired to guide her west. And she herself had been struck down and left in a dry ravine outside the New Mexico territory, presumed finished by the same hands that took everything else. She survived. She walked. And when she reached the sun-bleached town of Alma Colina with nothing but grief and $11, she did the only thing a woman with nothing does. She spent what little she had on what nobody else wanted: a collapsing, rat-chewed relay station at the edge of the old Santa Fe Trail spur, sold for back taxes, dismissed by every man in town as a pile of rotten timber not worth the paper of its own deed. It was foolish. It was desperate. And sealed beneath its hearthstone was a secret 90 years buried, one that would not only remake Ada Ferris's life, but return to an entire forgotten town what had been stolen from it nearly a century before. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Ada Ferris, if you are watching this from a town that time seems to have passed over, or from a place folks call forgotten. Tell us where you're from in the comments. We'd love to know we're not the only ones who believe. Overlooked places still hold something worth finding. Ada Ferris had been raised to believe that nothing discarded was ever truly worthless. And that belief had come to her the way most true things come to a child, quietly, through the hands of her mother. Constance Ferris kept a mending basket in the front room of their house in Independence, Missouri, and into that basket went every torn coat, every split seam, every garment other families had given up on. Ada remembered sitting at her mother's knee as a girl of 7 or 8, watching Constance turn a ruined shirt, collar inside out, and stitch it anew so that what had been frayed and yellowed on one side showed clean linen on the other. "There's always a good side left, Ada," her mother used to say, biting off thread with her teeth. "You only have to know how to turn a thing around." It was not a lesson about sewing. Ada understood that even then. It was a lesson about people, about places, about the whole bruised and threadbare world. And she carried it with her the way another child might carry a locket or a coin. Her father, Michael Ferris, was a freighter, one of the men who drove wagons of goods along the growing network of trails stretching west from the Missouri River towns. And from him Ada learned an entirely different set of skills: how to read a sky before a storm broke over it, how to judge the strength of a mule by the set of its ears, how to keep a ledger so exact that not a nickel could go missing between one town and the next. Freighting was not romantic work. It was long, filthy, dangerous, and thankless, and it demanded of a person an honesty that could not be faked, because every load was counted by someone at both ends of the journey. Michael Ferris was proud of his daughter's quick mind, and though it was not the custom of the time for a girl to learn a freighter's trade, he let her ride beside him on short hauls and taught her his trade the way he might have taught a son, because he had no son. And because he recognized in Ada an attentiveness that could not be wasted, it was on one of these hauls, delivering goods to a mercantile in a river town, that Ada met Thomas Calloway. No relation to the wealthy Calloways of the eastern seaboard, but a hard-working young man who drove freight of his own and who admired, more than anything else about Ada Ferris, the steadiness of her hands and the plainness of her honesty. They married when she was 22, and together they built a modest freighting partnership of their own, running goods along the developing trail routes that fed into the Santa Fe corridor: bolts of cloth, tools, medicine, seed grain, the unglamorous necessities that kept frontier towns alive. It was hard living, but it was living Ada understood. And for 2 decades, she and Thomas made their way west a little further each year, always with the same careful ledgers, the same fair dealing, the same insistence that a debt owed was a debt paid, in full, on time. No matter how thin the profit ran, she learned other things too. In those years, how to set a broken bone, how to draw fever from a body with willow bark and cool cloths, how to stitch a wound closed with the same steady hand her mother had used on torn collars. The frontier had no shortage of injury and illness, and Ada, without ever calling herself anything so grand as a healer, became the woman other travelers sought out when something went wrong on the trail. She did not know, in those years of quiet competence and hard-won skill, that everything she had built and everything she had learned to mend was about to be stripped from her in a single season, leaving her with less than she had owned as a barefoot child in her mother's front room. The fall came in the spring. When Ada was 46, on what should have been an unremarkable freighting run from Trinidad down toward the New Mexico Territory settlements, carrying a contracted load of tools and dry goods that Thomas had spent a hard winter arranging. They had hired on 2 extra hands for the trip. As was common when the load was heavy and the trail uncertain, a wagon master named Silas Groome, whom Thomas had worked with once before and trusted more than he should have, and a younger man called Ezra Pruitt, quiet and watchful in a way Ada had disliked from their first meeting, but had not been able to put a reason to. 3 weeks into the journey, deep in a stretch of dry country where help was a long way off in any direction, Thomas fell ill with a fever that would not break. Ada nursed him with everything she knew, but the fever took him in the night, quietly, the way it sometimes does, and she woke at dawn a widow in the middle of nowhere with a wagon of goods and no husband to help her see them through. Grief alone would have been a hard enough burden. But grief was not the worst of what that stretch of trail had waiting for her. Silas Groome, she would later understand, had been watching the value of that wagon's contents for the better part of the journey, waiting only for an opportunity, and Thomas's death handed him one. 2 nights after they buried Thomas in a shallow grave marked with stones, Groome and Pruitt came for the wagon itself, for the strong box of trading silver Thomas had carried to settle debts along the route, and for anything else worth taking. Ada woke to find them cutting the mules loose, and when she rose to stop them, Groome struck her down with the flat of a shovel and left her in a dry ravine off the trail, believing, or perhaps simply not caring, that she would not survive to name him. She lay there through a long night and a longer day, bruised, bleeding, robbed of husband and wagon and every possession that had been hers, before a passing rider found her and carried her the remaining distance into the town of Alma Colina, where a widow named Constance Vega took her in and nursed her back from the edge of death. It took Ada the better part of 2 months to recover enough strength to stand unaided. And when she finally did, she found herself exactly where our story began, 47 years old, entirely alone, with $11 sewn into the hem of a borrowed dress, in a town where she knew not a single soul beyond the widow who had shown her kindness. She could have written to distant cousins back in Missouri and begged passage home. She thought about it in the long nights of her recovery and decided against it. There was nothing in Missouri for her anymore, no home waiting, only the shame of returning with nothing to show for 25 years of honest work. Alma Colina, for all its dust and hardship, was at least a place where no one yet knew her as a woman who had lost everything. She resolved to begin again, however small that beginning had to be. It was Solomon Vega, the widow Constance's brother-in-law and the town's blacksmith, who first mentioned the old relay station to her. The county was auctioning off a handful of properties seized for unpaid taxes. He told her one evening, mostly worthless land nobody wanted, and among them was the abandoned coach station out past the north bend of the dry wash, a building so old and so long neglected that even the county assessor had stopped bothering to note its condition in his records. It had stood empty for as long as Solomon could remember, its roof half collapsed, its well fouled, its reputation among the superstitious faintly unlucky, though he could not say exactly why people said so. The starting bid, on account of its poor condition, was a mere $11. Ada Ferris, who had exactly that sum sewn into her hem and no other prospect in the world, walked into that auction on a hot Tuesday morning and bid the whole of what she owned on a building every other soul in Alma Colina considered fit only for tearing down. Asterisk. The men gathered at the courthouse steps laughed, not unkindly, but not gently either, when the auctioneer's gavel fell and the derelict station passed to a penniless widow woman nobody in town yet knew. "You've bought yourself a ruin, ma'am," one of them told her. Not without sympathy, and Ada, who had grown up watching her mother turn ruined collars into clean linen, only nodded and said that a ruin was still a roof. And a roof was more than she had owned the week before. She walked the 4 miles out to the station that same afternoon, because she owned no horse and no wagon to carry her there, and stood for a long while in front of the sagging structure with its broken shutters and its silent, weed-choked yard, feeling for the first time in months something that was not quite hope, but was at least its distant cousin, the sense that she had, however small, a thing of her own again. The station itself told the story of long neglect the moment she stepped inside. Dust lay thick over everything. The floorboards groaned with rot in places, and swallows had built nests in the rafters where the roof had opened to the sky. But beneath the neglect, Ada's trained eye could see something else. The bones of the place were sound. The stone hearth was solidly built, the walls thick adobe brick meant to withstand decades of weather, the sort of construction a person undertook only if they meant the building to last. Someone had built this station to endure, not merely to serve. That observation alone was enough to keep her working through the first exhausting week, clearing debris, patching the roof with what scrap lumber she could scavenge, sweeping decades of dust from corners that had not seen a broom since before she was born. It was on the 4th night, working by lamplight to clear ash and rubble from the long cold hearth, that Ada found the first thread of what would become the deepest mystery of her life. Her fingers, working along the underside of the hearthstone to clear packed dirt, caught on an edge that should not have been there, a seam, too straight and too deliberate to be the work of weather or time. She worked at it for the better part of an hour with a fire iron and stubborn patience. And at last the hearthstone shifted, revealing beneath it a small hollow lined with flat river stones. And within that hollow, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age, a brass tag stamped with initials she did not recognize, J.C., and a single tarnished coin. Old Spanish silver, dated decades before her own birth. Ada sat back on her heels in the dust and lamplight and understood, with the plain certainty of a woman who had spent her life reading signs other people missed, that this station had never been only a relay stop, and that whoever had built it had left something behind that mattered enough to hide. The days that followed were consumed by a search that Ada conducted, with the same patient thoroughness she had once, brought to a freight ledger, checking every seam, every loose brick, every board that gave slightly underfoot. It was Solomon Vega, riding out one afternoon to see how the widow woman was faring in her ruin, who supplied the piece that finally made sense of the brass tag and the buried coin. His own grandfather, he told her, sitting on an overturned crate while Ada poured him well water gone finely sweet since she'd cleared the fouling from it, had spoken once or twice in his old age of a man called Jubal Creed, who had built the relay station back when the Santa Fe Trail spur was newly cut, sometime around 1821, and who had run it for a handful of years as an honest way station before vanishing entirely from the country. Creed, Solomon said, his voice dropping the way old men's voices do when repeating stories half believed and half feared, had been more than a station master. He had, by his grandfather's account, robbed an army payroll wagon somewhere along the trail before he ever built the station, and used the station itself, and the respectability it lent him, to hide both himself and whatever he had taken, before disappearing one winter and never being heard from again. Most folks, Solomon admitted, had long ago decided the story was nothing but an old man's fireside exaggeration. But he had never forgotten his grandfather's insistence that Creed had never spent a cent of what he'd taken, not one. Because to spend it would have drawn the very attention he'd built the station to avoid. Ada listened to this with the careful attention she gave to everything, neither dismissing it as fancy nor accepting it whole. And that night, alone again in the station with only lamplight and her own patient hands, she resumed her search with new purpose. She found, over the following week, a locked strongbox hidden beneath a false floor panel in what had once been the station's small back room. And though the lock had rusted nearly solid, she worked it open with a bent nail and the same stubborn patience that had freed the Hearthstone. Inside, wrapped against the damp, she found not gold, not yet, but a station master's ledger, its pages brittle but legible, recording years of honest way station business under the name Jubal Creed. And tucked into the ledger's back cover, a single folded letter, unsigned, addressed to no one, written in a careful hand that spoke of guilt too heavy to carry and a fortune the writer no longer believed he had any right to spend. The letter did not say where the fortune was hidden. It said only that it remained close, beneath the roof that had sheltered his one attempt at an honest life, and that he hoped, if it was ever found, it would go to whoever needed it more than he ever had. The ledger gave him more than a mystery to solve. It gave her a map of the man himself, page after page of small, honest transactions, fair prices charged to trail-worn travelers, occasional notes of charity extended to families too poor to pay in full. Whatever Jubal Creed had once done to acquire his fortune, the years he'd spent running this station suggested a man attempting, in his own quiet and unconfessed way, to become someone worth being. Ada found herself, against all sense, feeling a kind of kinship with him, a fellow keeper of ledgers, a fellow believer that an honest reckoning mattered even when no one was watching. She spent the following days searching every wall and floor and outbuilding on the property with renewed determination, certain now that Creed's fortune, whatever it was, remained somewhere close, waiting the way her mother's mending basket had always insisted that something worth finding was worth the patience of the search. Word of a stranger digging around the old relay station did not stay quiet in a town the size of Alma Colina, and it was not long before Ada's search drew attention she had not sought and did not want. The first to come was Ashford Prescott, who held the note on a great deal of land around the town in his capacity as owner of the only bank for 40 miles, and who arrived at the station one afternoon in a buggy too fine for the dusty road, expressing polite concern for a widow living alone in such a hazardous, half-ruined structure, and offering, with a smoothness Ada distrusted immediately, to buy the property back from her for considerably more than the $11 she'd paid, to spare her the trouble. Ada, who had spent 25 years reading the true weight behind a man's words in a ledger and a handshake, understood at once that Prescott's sudden concern had nothing to do with her welfare and everything to do with the surveyor's talk she'd overheard in town of a proposed railroad spur that would run directly through this stretch of land, a spur that would make whoever controlled the old station's ground considerably wealthier than $11 could account for. She declined his offer, politely but firmly, and watched something harden behind his courteous smile as he climbed back into his buggy. The second visitor was worse. Silas Groome, the very wagon master who had struck her down and left her for dead in a dry ravine, arrived in Alma Colina scarcely a week later, drawn not by any knowledge of what she'd found, but by the same rumor of an outlaw's buried fortune that had begun, as such rumors do, to travel faster than truth ever manages. He did not at first recognize the recovering widow living at the old station as the same woman he had robbed and abandoned. Months before, she had been half dead and half hidden in darkness the last time he'd seen her face, but when he rode out to the station, under the pretense of offering to help a woman alone, "Search the grounds." And Ada opened the door to find him standing there. She felt the whole of that dry ravine rush back into her chest at once. She did not flinch, and she did not let him see recognition cross her face. Because she understood, in the same instant, that a man who believed himself unknown was a man who would make mistakes a careful woman could use against him. Asterisk. She sent word that same night, by way of Solomon Vita's fastest horse, to the territorial marshal's office in the county seat, providing a written account, dated and precise in the manner of every ledger she had ever kept, describing Silas Groome's theft and assault upon the trail, and his presence, now in Alma Colina, under a different manner but the same face. She did not wait passively for the marshal's response. She continued, in the days that followed, to search the station with Solomon's help, working now against two pressures at once: Prescott's mounting insistence that she sell, delivered through increasingly less polite intermediaries, and Groome's circling presence in town, where he had begun, she learned, quietly asking after the old stories of Jubal Creed's fortune from anyone who would talk to him. The discovery, when it finally came, arrived not through violence or confrontation, but through the same patient method that had guided every step of Ada's search. Rereading Creed's ledger for perhaps the 20th time, she noticed at last what she had overlooked in her earlier haste: a series of small, oddly specific entries scattered across several years, each recording a delivery of wellstone in quantities that made no sense for a well already built and functioning. Creed, she realized with the same quiet certainty she'd felt breaking open the Hearthstone, had used the pretense of well maintenance to disguise repeated trips to conceal something within the well's own structure, lowering material down in stages that would never draw a passing traveler's notice. Ada and Solomon worked through a long, careful day, lowering a lantern and themselves by rope into the fouled well behind the station. And there, in a false chamber built into the well's lower stone lining, sealed behind mortar, Creed had matched so carefully to the surrounding stone that 90 years of weather had never revealed the seam. They found it, a strong box far larger than the one in the house, packed with gold and silver coin, a small collection of army payroll notes, long since worthless as currency but priceless as proof, and a set of original land deeds to parcels throughout the valley that Creed had apparently purchased, quietly, in the years before he vanished, perhaps intending all along that the fortune find its way, eventually, to purposes larger than himself. Ada Ferris did not celebrate that discovery the way another woman might have. She sat for a long while at the well's edge in the fading light with Solomon beside her, turning one of the old coins over in her fingers, and thought not of what she might now buy or where she might now go, but of Jubal Creed's unsigned letter and its single plain hope that whatever he'd hidden might go to whoever needed it more than he ever had. She understood, sitting there, exactly what needed to be done. And it was not what Ashford Prescott had been hoping for, nor what Silas Groome had ridden into town believing he might yet claim for himself. The following weeks tested Ada in ways the discovery itself had not. Prescott, learning of the fortune within days, for such news could not stay contained in a town the size of Alma Colina, attempted to press a legal claim through the county courthouse, arguing that anything found upon land only recently transferred by tax auction belonged rightfully to the county, and by extension to whichever party held the greatest financial interest in the surrounding parcels, a maneuver so transparent that even the county's own recorder, a plain-spoken man named Otis Rias, found himself embarrassed to entertain it. Ada met Prescott's legal pressure the same way she had once met every disputed freight bill in her old life, with documentation, patience, and an insistence on being heard in full. She produced Creed's ledger, his letter, the original deeds bearing his signature, and the auction record proving her clear and lawful purchase of the property. and laid the whole matter before the territorial court with the same steady thoroughness her father had taught her, decades before overfreight manifests in Missouri. The court, presented with such careful evidence, found in her favor without hesitation, and Prescott's claim collapsed under the weight of its own transparent greed, leaving him diminished in the town's estimation in a way his money could not repair. Silas Groome's reckoning arrived by simpler means. The territorial marshal, acting on Ada's dated and precise account, rode into Alma Colina within the fortnight and took Groome into custody on the trail robbery and assault charges she had documented. And though Groome protested loudly that he was owed some share of whatever the widow woman had found, no court in the territory was inclined to entertain the claims of a man now facing trial for having left that very widow woman for dead. He was tried the following spring in the county seat and sentenced to a long term of imprisonment, and Ezra Pruitt, his accomplice, was found some months later in a neighboring territory and brought back to answer for his own part in the crime. Ada attended neither trial. She had by then other work occupying her hands and her heart, work that mattered a great deal more to her than watching justice close its hand around the men who had wronged her, for justice, however satisfying, was never the whole of what Ada intended to do with Jubal Creed's fortune. She understood, turning the matter over in her mind through long evenings at the Mending station, that a fortune hoarded for personal comfort would have honored nothing about the letter she'd found, nor about the man who wrote it, nor about her own mother's old conviction that a thing's worth was measured by what it could still become in the right hands. She spent the fortune, in the months that followed, not on herself but on Alma Colina itself, funding the long-delayed repair of the town's schoolhouse roof, which had leaked for 3 winters running while the county debated whose responsibility it was to fix, establishing a small fund at Otis Reyes's honest recommendation to forgive the debts of the valley's poorest tenant farmers, families who had been quietly strangled for years by notes held at Prescott's bank, and restoring, plank by plank and stone by stone, the relay station itself, not as a private home, but as a way station once more, open to any traveler in need of shelter, exactly as Jubal Creed had once run it in his own uncertain attempt at redemption. She kept, for herself, only enough to live modestly and comfortably, and the old brass tag stamped J.C., which she hung above the station's rebuilt hearth, as a quiet acknowledgment of the man whose guilt and hidden generosity had, 90 years on, found the very purpose he'd hoped it might. And so we return, as we always do, to where this story began, to a woman of 47 with $11 and nothing else in the world, standing before a ruin every other soul in Alma Colina had dismissed as worthless. Ada Ferris did not find Jubal Creed's fortune because she was lucky, and she did not restore it to her town because she was owed some grand reward for her suffering. She found it because she had spent a lifetime learning to see the good side left in a ruined thing, the way her mother had taught her over a mending basket decades before, turning frayed collars into clean linen one patient stitch at a time. She restored it to the town because she understood, in her bones, that a fortune hidden out of guilt could only be redeemed by generosity, and that the truest justice available to her was not vengeance against the men who had wronged her, but the quiet, steady work of building up what they had tried to tear down. What Ada Ferris proved in the end was not that treasure waits beneath every ruin. It does not, but that patience, honesty, and a willingness to look closely at what others have thrown away will, more often than the world expects, uncover something worth the looking. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Ada Ferris's story. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need reminding that overlooked places and overlooked people still hold worth. Before you go, we'd love to ask you something in the comments. What is a time you found value in something the rest of the world had already written off? We read every answer, and we love hearing them. Until next time, stay close. Asterisk.